Marcus Thorne stood at the epicenter of the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom, a glass of 1996 Dom Perignon raised like a scepter. Beside him, Tiffany Sterling shimmered in silver Tom Ford, her arm draped with a Himalayan crocodile Birkin, a bag that cost more than the average American's home. "To an upgraded life," Marcus boasted to the circle of New York's elite, his eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. "I finally traded in the reliable sedan for a supercar." The room erupted in polite, cruel laughter, everyone knowing the sedan was his ex-wife, Sophia. Marcus thought he had won the world. He didn't realize the world was about to stop spinning. The air in the ballroom was a suffocating blend of expensive peonies, Santal 33, and the metallic tang of old money. It was the annual Starlight benefit, an evening where the Forbes 400 mingled with those desperate to be among them. For Marcus Thorne, a senior vice president at the cutthroat investment firm Vanguard Hedge, this wasn't just a charity gala, it was a victory lap. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke Brioni tuxedo, feeling the reassuring weight of his Patek Philippe against his wrist. On his arm, Tiffany Sterling was less a fiancée and more a curated masterpiece of Park Avenue aesthetics. Her blonde hair was a sculpture of silk, and her smile was as bright and vacant as a high-end showroom. But it was the bag she held, the white gold and diamond hardware catching the light of the massive crystal chandeliers, that acted as their true passport. "Darling, keep the hardware toward the cameras," Marcus whispered, his voice a smooth, practiced purr. "Let them see the gradient. Most of these people have never even seen a Himalayan in person." Tiffany offered a feline smirk. "You're so bad, Marcus, but you're right. It does make every other woman in this room look suburban." Marcus beamed. He felt a surge of adrenaline that no stock option could provide. For years he had felt anchored by Sophia Reyes. Sophia, with her unruly dark curls and her quaint obsession with data ethics and community gardens. She was a woman who preferred a worn paperback to a portfolio, a woman who had worked 2 jobs to put him through his MBA at Wharton, only to be told 10 years later that she no longer fit the brand. "Marcus, you look positively triumphant," cooed Victoria Belmont, the matriarch of the Belmont shipping empire. Her face, pulled tight by decades of surgical interventions, resembled a porcelain mask. Beside her stood Winston Vance, a portly banker whose family had owned half of Manhattan since the Dutch arrived. "Victoria, Winston, you both look wonderful," Marcus replied, leaning in with the practiced intimacy of a man who knew how to play the game. "I was just telling Tiffany how refreshing it is to be in a room where people actually appreciate the finer things. My ex-wife. Well, you remember Sophia? She would have spent this evening talking about the carbon footprint of the appetizers." Winston chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound. "Ah, yes. The girl who wanted to save the world but couldn't save her own marriage. A bit simple for a man of your trajectory, Marcus." "Simple is the word," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "I remember I bought her a Cartier love bracelet for our 5th anniversary. Classic, right? Do you know what she said? She asked if I could return it and donate the money to an animal shelter's website redesign. She had no concept of markers, no understanding that in our world these things are the language of success." He failed to mention that he had given her that bracelet the day after she had been laid off from her job as a senior data analyst, a job she loved. He hadn't given it to comfort her. He had given it to replace her identity. He wanted a wife who was a trophy, not a person with a professional crisis. Their divorce had been a surgical strike. Marcus's lawyers, a pack of piranhas from Sullivan and Cromwell, had painted Sophia as a leech, a woman of modest background who contributed nothing to the marital assets, conveniently ignoring the decade she spent as his emotional and financial foundation. They had stripped her of her dignity, leaving her with nothing but her personal savings and a bruised heart. Now, a year later, Marcus was engaged to the daughter of a real estate mogul. He had the bag, the girl, and the deal of a lifetime on the horizon. "I heard she's working for some tiny tech non-profit now," Tiffany added, her voice dripping with mock pity. "Somewhere in Brooklyn. Can you imagine? The commute alone would kill me." "It's where she belongs," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the room for the next person to impress. "In the shadows of the real players. Some people are just destined to be the background noise in someone else's symphony." The evening progressed like a well-oiled machine of calculated compliments. Marcus was in the middle of retelling his favorite anecdote about a hostile takeover when he felt it, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. It wasn't a noise, it was the opposite. It was a sudden, creeping silence that began at the grand arched entrance of the ballroom and rippled outward like a drop of ink in a glass of water. Conversations faltered. The clink of silver against china ceased. Winston Vance stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he looked toward the doorway. "Good God," he muttered. "Is that—" Marcus felt a prickle of annoyance. He hated being interrupted. He turned, ready to dismiss whatever minor celebrity or eccentric billionaire had just arrived to steal his spotlight. The woman standing in the grand archway did not make an entrance. She simply existed, and the room bowed to the fact. She wasn't wearing silver or gold. She was draped in a floor-length sheath of midnight blue silk so dark it was almost black. The tailoring was hauntingly perfect, skimming her silhouette with a quiet, architectural elegance that made Tiffany's Tom Ford look like a costume. Her hair, once unruly, was swept back into a sleek, low chignon, revealing a face that was no longer quaint. It was a face of steel and silence. Beside her stood a man the world rarely saw in person, Julian Vane, the reclusive titan of Vane Quantum Industries, a man who had revolutionized the global energy grid and was rumored to be the first trillionaire in waiting. He was a kingmaker, and he was looking at the woman beside him with a level of deference that Marcus had never seen him accord to a head of state. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. His heart, which had been thumping with the rhythm of victory, now felt like a lead weight in his chest. The woman was Sophia. But it wasn't the Sophia who had cried in the lawyer's office. It wasn't the Sophia who had cooked him pasta while he complained about empty carbs. This woman held herself with a serene, terrifying confidence. She looked like she owned the Pierre. She looked like she owned the city. "Marcus!" Tiffany's voice was a sharp, panicked whisper. Her grip on his arm tightened, her nails digging into the wool of his tuxedo. "Marcus, that's her. That's the ex-wife. What is she doing with Julian Vane?" Marcus couldn't answer. His throat was suddenly lined with glass. He watched as the hostess, Victoria Belmont, who had just been mocking Sophia, practically sprinted across the floor to greet her, her face transformed into a mask of sycophantic adoration. As Sophia and Julian Vane moved toward the center of the room, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Sophia's gaze drifted across the room, cool and unbothered, until it landed directly on Marcus. She didn't flinch, she didn't glare. She simply looked at him as if he were a smudge of dust on an otherwise perfect lens. In that moment, the Himalayan Birkin on Tiffany's arm, the symbol of Marcus's upgrade, suddenly looked like a cheap, gaudy toy. The shock in the ballroom was palpable, a physical weight that seemed to dim the glow of the thousands of candles flickering in their crystal hurricane lamps. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still gripping the stem of his champagne flute so tightly he feared the crystal might shatter. His mind was a frantic machine trying to reconcile the woman in the midnight blue silk with the woman he had discarded. "It's a mistake," his ego whispered, a desperate, clawing sound. "She's a +1, a temporary ornament for a man like Vane. She probably met him at some charity car wash." "Marcus, you're hurting me," Tiffany hissed. He looked down to see his knuckles white, his grip on her arm leaving red indentations near her elbow. "Sorry," he muttered, though his eyes never left Sophia. Across the room, Julian Vane, a man whose face usually looked as though it were carved from the granite of the Swiss Alps, was laughing, actually laughing. He leaned down, whispering something into Sophia's ear, and she responded with a small, knowing smile that carried more authority than any of Marcus's boardroom shouting matches. The social sharks of Manhattan began to pivot. Marcus watched with mounting horror as the circle of elites that had just been orbiting him and Tiffany began to drift toward the new arrivals. Even Winston Vance, the man who had just called Sophia simple, was now adjusting his tie and smoothing his hair, waiting for an opening to introduce himself to the woman he had just mocked. "We have to go over there," Tiffany said, her voice trembling with a mix of avarice and anxiety. "Marcus, if she's with Vane, we need to be in that circle. My father has been trying to get a meeting with Vane Quantum for 3 years." "I know that," Marcus snapped. He took a large gulp of champagne, the bubbles burning his throat. He needed to reassert control. He needed to remind the room, and Sophia, who the protagonist of this story was. He began to move, pulling Tiffany behind him like a tethered boat. As they wove through the crowd, Marcus felt the eyes of his peers on his back. The whispers followed them like a wake. "Is that his ex? I thought he said she was a non-profit clerk. Look at her dress. That's bespoke Ferragamo, isn't it?" By the time they reached the inner circle, Victoria Belmont was already gushing. "Sophia, dear, it has been far too long. We were just saying how the Starlight benefit hasn't felt the same without your unique energy." Sophia turned. Her gaze was level, her expression a mask of polite indifference. "Thank you, Victoria. Though I don't recall being invited last year. Or was that the year Marcus's lawyers argued that my presence at these events was a theatrical expense?" A sharp, collective intake of breath echoed through the group. Victoria's smile faltered, her porcelain face cracking with a micro-expression of sheer panic. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with a false booming bravado. "Sophia, what a surprise. I see you've managed to find your way into some very high-altitude company tonight." He pointedly looked at Julian Vane, extending a hand. "Marcus Thorne, Mr. Vane. I'm a senior VP at Vanguard Hedge. We've actually done some extensive analysis on your lithium-ion supply chains." Julian Vane didn't take the hand. He didn't even acknowledge it. He kept his arm loosely tucked behind his back, his eyes as sharp and cold as a winter sky, scanning Marcus with the clinical curiosity of a biologist, looking at a particularly dull specimen of pond life. "Thorne," Vane said, the name sounding like a discarded object in his mouth. "I don't recall seeing your name on my schedule." Marcus's hand hung in the air for a second too long before he pulled it back, pretending to adjust his watch. "Well, you're a busy man. And Sophia? Well, Sophia was always good at finding her way into rooms she wasn't invited to. I assume you're helping Mr. Vane with some of his local outreach programs. Community gardens, perhaps." He directed the comment at Sophia, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He was trying to unmask her, to remind the billionaires around them that she was the girl who worried about shelter animals and carbon footprints. Tiffany, sensing an opening to reclaim her status, stepped forward, her Himalayan Birkin swinging prominently on her arm. She let the diamond-encrusted hardware catch the light directly in Sophia's eyes. "It really is lovely to see you, Sophia," Tiffany said, her voice a saccharine trill. "Marcus told me so much about your humble interests. It's so important to have hobbies while the rest of us handle the heavy lifting of the city. I'm Tiffany, by the way, Marcus's fiancée." She emphasized the word like a brand. Sophia's eyes dropped to the bag, then back to Tiffany's face. "The Himalayan," Sophia said quietly. "It's a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, Tiffany, truly. I believe there's an 18-month waiting list for that particular model." Tiffany's chest puffed out. Actually, Marcus pulled some very special strings. It was an early engagement gift, only the best for the Thorne family. "Of course," Sophia replied. She turned her head slightly toward Marcus. I suppose strings are the only thing you have left to pull, Marcus, since your integrity was frayed long ago. Now look here, Sophia. Marcus started, his voice rising. But Julian Vane stepped in, his presence suddenly looming, casting a shadow over Marcus's frantic energy. Integrity isn't a string, Thorn. It's a foundation. And it's the reason Sophia is currently the most sought-after mind in the energy sector. The circle went dead silent. Marcus felt a cold sweat break out along the nape of his neck. I'm sorry? The energy sector? She's a data analyst, a mid-level clerk. Vane gave a short, dry laugh. You really didn't know? Or were you too busy looking at handbags to notice that your wife was patenting the most disruptive solid-state battery technology of the decade? Marcus felt the floor beneath him tilt. He looked at Sophia, searching for the lie, but he found only a serene, devastating truth. I believe the phrase you used during the divorce was dead weight, wasn't it, Marcus? Sophia asked. Her voice was calm, devoid of the anger he could have fought. The lack of emotion was what hurt. It was the sound of a woman who had already moved on to a future where he didn't exist. You told the judge I had no commercial viability, that my years of research were just a quaint distraction from your career. Sophia, It's all right, she interrupted, turning back to Julian. Mr. Vane, I think I'd like a drink before the auction begins. The air in here has become a bit stale. As they turned to walk away, the crowd didn't just part. They scrambled to get out of Sophia's path. Marcus stood rooted to the spot, the silver-clad Tiffany still clutching his arm. He felt like a man who had been watching a black-and-white film and had suddenly been blinded by a world in high-definition color. Marcus, Tiffany hissed, her face pale. What did he mean? Patents, solid-state technology. My father said the company that holds those patents is worth billions. He said they were called Helios Innovations. Marcus felt the blood roaring in his ears. Helios, the Greek god of the sun. He remembered Sophia's old legal pads, filled with sketches of phytoplankton and chemical equations. He remembered laughing at her, telling her to stop wasting her time on science projects and start networking with the wives of the managing directors. It's a fluke, Marcus whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. She probably sold the idea for a pittance. She's just a figurehead. But he knew, deep in the hollow space where his conscience used to be, he knew. He had thrown away a diamond because he thought it was a jagged rock, and he had replaced it with a piece of polished glass that was currently digging its nails into his arm. The auction was about to begin, the main event, and Marcus, driven by a desperate, primal need to prove he was still a king, decided on a gamble that would either save his reputation or bury him alive. The ballroom transitioned into a state of high-octane theater as the guests were ushered toward the velvet-draped stage for the night's centerpiece, the live auction. The air felt different now, thicker, charged with the static electricity of redirected allegiances. Marcus felt as if he were walking through waist-deep water. People who had laughed at his jokes 30 minutes ago were now suddenly engrossed in their programs the moment he approached, their bodies angled toward the front of the room where Sophia and Julian Vane had taken a seat in the primary row. Marcus sat 3 rows back, his fingers drumming a frantic, syncopated beat on his thigh. Tiffany was a statue beside him, her silver dress reflecting the stage lights in a way that felt suddenly, agonizingly garish. She kept adjusting the Himalayan Birkin on her lap, but the gesture had lost its confidence. It looked like a shield now, an expensive piece of leather held by someone who realized they were in a room full of people wearing armor. She's a fraud, Tiff, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Vane is just using her as a face for a tax write-off. No one goes from a data analyst at a non-profit to a patent-holding mogul in 18 months. It's a shell game. Tiffany didn't look at him. She was staring at the back of Sophia's head. He called her a visionary, Marcus. Julian Vane doesn't use that word for tax write-offs. He uses it for people who make him richer. "He's a man," Marcus hissed. "He's impressed by a pretty face and a few lines of code she probably bought off some kid in Estonia. Watch. I'm going to show this room who the real player is." The mistake began with the first gavel strike. The auctioneer was Eleanor Vance Sterling, a woman whose lineage was so storied it was whispered that her ancestors had arrived before the Dutch. She stood behind a podium of polished mahogany, her voice a clarion call of refined authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here for the Starlight benefit, but tonight we are also here to witness the extraordinary," Eleanor announced. The first few lots were the usual fare: private villas in Tuscany, a week on a super yacht in the Maldives, a rare case of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild. Marcus watched the numbers climb, his pulse accelerating. He needed a moment, a grand gesture. He needed to remind the room that he was the one with the liquidity, the one who belonged in the Bugatti of high society. "And now," Eleanor said, her eyes sweeping the room, "we come to Lot 7. A piece of history and a masterpiece of modern design. A one-of-a-kind bespoke necklace by Graf, featuring a 20-carat vivid yellow diamond, surrounded by 40 carats of D-flawless white diamonds." The lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit a velvet bust on a rotating pedestal. The yellow diamond was a drop of liquid sun, radiating a brilliance that seemed to hum. The room gasped. "We will open the bidding at $200,000, Eleanor stated. Marcus felt Tiffany's hand tighten on his arm. This was it. The necklace was the ultimate marker. If he bought this, he wouldn't just be buying jewelry, he would be buying a public restoration of his status. He would put it on Tiffany's neck right here in front of Sophia and prove that he was the provider, the king, the one who dictated the value of the women in his life. "250, someone shouted from the back. 300, came another. The bidding climbed with the speed of a forest fire. 400, 500, 600. 700,000, Marcus called out, his voice booming, unnaturally loud in the hushed room. A ripple of murmurs followed. People turned in their seats. Marcus straightened his tie, offering a smug, tight-lipped smile to the row ahead. He caught a glimpse of Sophia's profile. She hadn't even turned around. She was leaning toward Julian Vane, whispering something that made him smile. The lack of attention was a fresh cut to Marcus's ego. 700,000 once, Eleanor said. 750 to the gentleman in the tuxedo. 800, Marcus barked. He felt a cold sweat under his arms. 800,000 was a staggering amount. It was his entire annual bonus, plus a significant portion of his liquidated stock options. It was money he should be keeping for the down payment on the New Hamptons house he'd promised Tiffany's father, but the madness of the moment had taken hold. 800,000 once, Eleanor said. Twice. A paddle went up in the front row. Not Sophia's, Julian Vane's. 1 million, Julian said, his voice effortless, as if he were ordering a cup of coffee. The room erupted. $1 million for a necklace was high, even for the Starlight benefit. 1.1, Marcus yelled, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Marcus, stop, Tiffany whispered, her voice laced with a sudden, genuine fear. We can't. My father said the deal isn't signed yet. We don't have the cash flow for this. Shut up, Tiffany, Marcus snapped, his eyes locked on the back of Julian Vane's head. He's bluffing. He's trying to see if I have the stomach for it. 1.2, Julian countered, his tone bored. 1.5, Marcus screamed. The room went dead silent. Eleanor Vance Sterling paused, her gavel held mid-air. $1.5 million. It was financial suicide for someone in Marcus's position, but in his mind it was the only way to kill the ghost of Sophia's new life. He was winning. He was outspending the trillionaire. Then Sophia did something that broke him. She placed her hand on Julian's arm, pulling his paddle down. She whispered something and Julian nodded, a small, amused smirk on his lips. He leaned back, crossing his legs, and looked over his shoulder directly at Marcus. "It's all yours, Thorne," Julian said, his voice carrying through the silence like a gunshot. "Some people know when a piece of glass is being sold for the price of a diamond. I'll let you have the honor of being overcharged." Eleanor's gavel came down with a thunderous crack. "Sold to Mr. Marcus Thorne for $1.5 million. There was applause, but it wasn't the warm, admiring sound Marcus had envisioned. It was staccato, awkward, filled with the hushed whispers of people who knew he had just been baited into a trap. Marcus sat back, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it would crack his ribs. He had won, but as he looked at Sophia, who was now being greeted by the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, he felt a sickening hollow opening up in his gut. He had spent a fortune to humiliate her, but Sophia hadn't even competed. She had simply let him walk himself onto the gallows. I need to use the restroom," Marcus muttered, his face pale. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't see the way the room was shifting. He didn't see the way Sophia was reaching into her small, elegant clutch as she stood up to head toward the bar for the intermission. He only knew he had to get away from the lights. But as he pushed through the swinging doors toward the hallway, he ran right into the one person he couldn't face. Sophia was standing by the mahogany bar, waiting for a glass of water. She was alone for a brief second. Marcus stopped, his breathing ragged. "I hope you're happy," he spat, the bitterness overflowing. $1.5 million. That's what it costs to remind you that I'm still the one who dictates the terms, Sophia. You're playing dress-up with a billionaire, but I'm the one who actually owns the room." Sophia turned to him. There was no anger in her eyes, only a profound, clinical pity. "You always did confuse price with value, Marcus," she said quietly. "You think you bought a victory, but all you did was prove to every person in that room that you're desperate. And desperation is a scent that never washes off. I have a business to run, a fiancé who is a sterling, and a future you can't even imagine," Marcus growled, stepping into her space. "What do you have, Sophia? A few patents? A mentor who's probably bored of you by now?" The bartender arrived with her water. Sophia took the glass, then reached into her clutch to pay the mandatory donation for the drink. She didn't pull out a paddle. She didn't pull out a checkbook. She pulled out a card. It was a solid, weighty piece of anodized titanium. It didn't reflect the light. It seemed to swallow it. In the center was the matte black face of a Roman centurion, the American Express centurion card, the black card. The bartender froze, his hands trembling as he took the card. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that card. He had applied for it 3 times and been rejected every time. It wasn't something you earned with a high salary. It was something given to those whose wealth was so vast it was considered a force of nature. "This is on me, Marcus," Sophia said, her voice like silk. "Since you've spent so much on a necklace you can't afford, I'd hate for you to have to pay for your own drink." The silence at the bar was not the empty silence of a vacant room. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of an airlock about to blow. The bartender, a man who had spent 20 years serving the most powerful people in the world, stared at the piece of black titanium in his palm as if it were an unexploded device. He didn't look at the card's expiration date. He didn't check the magnetic strip. He simply looked at the matte black Roman centurion and felt the shift in the room's hierarchy. Marcus felt a cold, oily sweat slicking his palms. His mind raced, searching for a way to invalidate the moment. "It's veins," he managed to choke out, his voice sounding thin and reedy to his own ears. "You're using his authorized user card. That's low, even for you, Sophia, to flaunt a man's credit like it's your own." Sophia didn't even look at him. She was watching the bartender, who was now handling the card with the reverence usually reserved for a piece of the true cross. "Actually, sir," the bartender whispered, his voice trembling with a new, profound deference, "the name on the card is Sophia Reyes, and it's It's a founding invitation. I've only seen one other in my career. Marcus felt the blood drain from his extremities, leaving him lightheaded. A founding invitation. That wasn't just wealth, it was legacy. It was a recognition by the financial gods that your influence was so foundational, they wanted you in the inner sanctum before the doors even opened. It's a mistake, Marcus hissed, stepping toward the bar, his hand reaching out as if to snatch the card away. She was a data analyst 18 months ago. She lived in a walk-up in Astoria. She doesn't spend enough in a decade to qualify for that. Sophia finally turned her head. Her dark eyes were pools of absolute stillness. I stopped spending on your vanity, Marcus. I started investing in my own vision. You'd be surprised how much capital you have when you aren't busy subsidizing a man's ego. Behind them, a flash went off, then another. Marcus turned to see a cluster of guests, including the junior analyst from his own firm, holding up their phones. The YouTube drama of the evening had officially entered the digital bloodstream. Within minutes, the image of the quaint ex-wife paying for Marcus Thorne's drink with a Centurion card would be circulating through every WhatsApp group and Slack channel in the financial district. "Marcus!" Tiffany appeared through the crowd, her silver dress looking wrinkled, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. She saw the card on the bar. She saw the way the bartender was looking at Sophia. Then she saw the phones. "Marcus, we have to go. Now," she whispered, grabbing his arm. But she wasn't looking at him with love or concern. She was looking at him with the cold, calculating eyes of a person who realizes they are standing next to a sinking ship. "The event organizers are asking for the wire transfer details for the necklace. They want the first 500,000 as a deposit tonight." I have 30 days, Marcus stammered, his eyes darting between Sophia and the predatory faces of his peers. "They changed the terms," Tiffany hissed, "because of the bid size, because Julian Vane dropped out. They're worried you don't have it, Marcus. They're hearing things." The social sharks were moving in. Winston Vance and Victoria Belmont were standing just a few feet away, their faces no longer sycophantic, but sharp with the morbid curiosity of people watching a public execution. "Is everything all right, Marcus?" Winston asked, his voice dripping with faux concern. "We heard there might be a bit of a liquidity crunch. Strange, for a man who just bid 1.5 million on a yellow diamond." Sophia took her card back from the bartender, sliding it into her clutch with a motion so casual it felt like a slap. She didn't stay to watch the fallout. She didn't need to. She had already delivered the verdict. "Julian is waiting for me," Sophia said quietly. She looked at Tiffany, her gaze lingering for a moment on the Himalayan Birkin. "It really is a lovely bag, Tiffany. I hope it's enough to keep you warm when the smoke clears. Because Marcus doesn't build homes. He builds stages, and the lights are about to go out." She walked away, the midnight blue silk of her dress whispering against the floor. As she rejoined Julian Vane, the crowd didn't just part. They leaned in, desperate to be caught in her orbit, to be seen in the background of the photos that would define the night. Marcus stood at the bar, the scent of expensive gin and his own fear cloying in his nostrils. He looked at Tiffany, searching for a lifeline, but she was already backing away, her hand moving to her throat, her fingers brushing the empty space where the Graf necklace was supposed to be. "Tiffany, wait!" he pleaded. "Don't," she said, her voice hard. "You used me, Marcus. You used my father's name to get into this room. You used me to prove a point to a woman who is 10 times the person you'll ever be. And you didn't even have the money to back up your own lies." "I have the money," he roared, but it was the sound of a cornered animal. "No, you have debt," Tiffany said, her lip curling in a sneer that finally matched her silver dress. "I've seen the notices from the Porsche dealership. I know about the margin calls on your Vanguard stock. You're a fraud, and the worst part isn't that you're broke. It's that you're boring." She turned on her heel and vanished into the crowd, leaving Marcus alone at the bar. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a vacuum. The bartender placed a glass of sparkling water on the mahogany surface. "On the house, sir," the man said, his voice no longer deferential, but laced with a stinging, clinical pity. "It looks like you've had enough." Marcus looked up at the crystal chandeliers, the frescoed ceiling, the diamonds, and the champagne. For the first time in his life, he didn't see a ladder to be climbed. He saw a cage, a gilded, suffocating cage that he had built for himself, bar by expensive bar. He reached for the water, but his hand shook so violently that the glass tipped, the liquid spilling across the polished wood, soaking into the sleeve of his bespoke tuxedo. Across the room he saw Sophia laugh, a genuine, unfettered sound. She wasn't laughing at him. She had forgotten he was even there, and that was the most brutal revenge of all. The spilled sparkling water seeped into the fine wool of Marcus's sleeve, a cold, spreading dampness that felt like the first touch of a winter grave. He stood paralyzed at the bar, his eyes fixed on the puddle, unable to look up and meet the collective gaze of the room. He could hear the cameras, the subtle click-whir of high-end lenses, and the haptic taps of smartphones were the new sounds of the guillotine. "Mr. Thorne," the voice was like a shard of ice. Marcus turned slowly to find Eleanor Vance Sterling standing beside him. She was no longer the graceful auctioneer. She was the chairperson of the board, and her patience had expired. Beside her stood a man Marcus feared even more, Alistair Croft, the managing director of Vanguard Hedge, Marcus's boss. Alistair didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which in the world of high finance was the precursor to being erased. "Marcus," Alistair said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "A word. In the library. Now." The walk to the hotel's private library felt like a slow-motion march to an execution. They passed the buffet, where the scent of truffle risotto and seared wagyu now made Marcus's stomach turn with a violent nausea. He saw Sophia in the distance, surrounded by the senator and a group of venture capitalists. She was holding Julian Vane's hand, not for support, but as an equal. The image was burned into Marcus's retinas. The woman he called dead weight was now the anchor of the most powerful circle in the room. The library doors closed, muffling the festive roar of the gala into a dull, heartbeat-like thrum. "Explain the bid, Marcus," Eleanor said, crossing her arms. $1.5 million for a necklace you don't have the liquidity to cover. We've already had 3 calls from the credit desk. Your accounts are flagged, and the Graph representatives are threatening a public fraud suit. It was a tactical play," Marcus stammered, his hands shaking so much he had to tuck them into his pockets. "I was trying to drive up the price for Vane. I didn't think he'd drop out." "You were playing poker with a man who owns the casino," Alistair interjected, his eyes narrowing. "But that's not why we're here, Marcus. While you were busy making a fool of yourself on the auction floor, my phone was blowing up. Do you know who Helios Innovations is?" Marcus swallowed hard. "Sophia's company. Vane said—" "Julian Vane didn't just say it, Marcus. Helios Innovations is the primary holder of the next generation solid-state patent. Every major tech firm in the world is trying to get a piece of them." Alistair leaned in, his face inches from Marcus's. "And 10 minutes ago, I received an official notice. Helios Innovations and Vane Quantum are pulling all their institutional assets from Vanguard Hedge. They cited a lack of institutional integrity and specifically named you as the reason." The room seemed to spin. She can't do that. That's billions in AUM, assets under management." "She just did," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of pity. "She didn't just win the night, Marcus. She just gutted your career. The board is meeting tomorrow morning. I suggest you have your desk cleared by 8. "Alistair, wait," Marcus pleaded, stepping toward his boss. "I can fix this. I can talk to her. She's my wife, ex-wife. She's just emotional. This is just a woman's revenge." Alistair looked at Marcus with a disgust so profound it was almost quiet. That's your problem, Marcus. You think this is a soap opera. You think she's emotional. I watched her out-negotiate the senator and Julian Vane in the same breath tonight. She isn't emotional. She's efficient, and she's decided that you are a bad investment. They left him there, alone among the leather-bound books and the scent of old paper. Marcus stood in the center of the library, the silence ringing in his ears. He grabbed a crystal decanter of scotch from a side table and poured a glass, his teeth chattering against the rim as he drank. He was ruined. The penthouse, the Porsche, the sterling connection. It was all a house of cards, and Sophia had just breathed on it. He walked back out into the ballroom, driven by a desperate, drunken need to confront her one last time. He didn't care about the cameras anymore. He didn't care about the YouTube drama that was surely trending under hashtags like #BlackCardRevenge and #ThornFallout. He found her near the exit, Julian Vane's coat draped over her shoulders. They were leaving. "Sophia!" Marcus roared, his voice echoing off the frescoed ceiling. The room went quiet again. The guests turned, their faces lit by the glow of their phones, recording the final act. Sophia stopped and turned. She looked at Marcus, and for the first time he saw something other than pity. He saw a flick of the old Sophia, the one who had worked 2 jobs to pay his tuition, but it was buried under layers of cold, hard-won wisdom. "You took everything," Marcus spat, swaying on his feet. "The job, the reputation, the girl. You planned this. You came here to destroy me." Sophia stepped away from Julian, walking toward Marcus until she was just a few feet away. The midnight blue silk of her dress shimmered like deep water. "I didn't come here for you, Marcus," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I came here to support a STEM center for children who don't have a voice. I forgot you were even on the guest list until I heard you shouting about a handbag." "You pulled the accounts," Marcus yelled. "You ruined the firm." "I protected my investors," Sophia corrected him. "I would never leave my company's future in the hands of a man who values a crocodile skin bag over his own financial solvency. That's not revenge, Marcus. That's just good business." "You were nobody," Marcus screamed, his face contorted. "I made you. I gave you the life that allowed you to sit in that lab." Sophia smiled then, and it was the saddest thing Marcus had ever seen. "No, Marcus. You gave me the silence I needed to finally hear myself. You gave me the loneliness I needed to build something that wouldn't break. You didn't make me. You just got out of the way." She turned her back on him for the final time. Julian Vane stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her waist, and they walked through the grand doors into the crisp New York night. Marcus tried to follow, but he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. It was the hotel security. "Mr. Thorne," the guard said firmly, "I think it's time for you to leave." As they led him toward the service exit, away from the cameras, away from the diamonds, away from the world he had sacrificed his soul to join, Marcus looked back at the ballroom. In the center of the floor, abandoned on a chair, was Tiffany's silver Tom Ford wrap and the Himalayan Birkin. It sat there, a $60,000 trophy with no one to carry it, looking exactly like what it was, a beautiful, empty skin. The rain began as Marcus hit the pavement of Fifth Avenue, a cold, needle-like drizzle that felt like the city itself was trying to wash him into the gutter. He stood on the curb, his bespoke tuxedo soaked, watching the red taillights of the limousines fade into the mist. He reached into his pocket for his phone to call an Uber, but his hands shook so violently the device slipped from his wet fingers, the screen spiderwebbing against the concrete. When he finally managed to flag a yellow cab, a vehicle he hadn't stepped foot in for years, the interior smelled of stale tobacco and cheap air freshener. It was a jarring, violent contrast to the scent of peonies and Dom Perignon he had inhabited only an hour ago. "The Legacy Penthouse," Marcus rasped, his voice sounding like a ghost's. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes lingering on Marcus's disheveled hair and ruined sleeve. "Rough night, pal?" Marcus didn't answer. He leaned his forehead against the cold window, watching the neon lights of Manhattan blur into long, jagged streaks of color. His mind was a battlefield of what-ifs. If he hadn't bid on the necklace, if he hadn't insulted the card, if he hadn't left Sophia in the first place, by the time he reached his penthouse, the digital world had already devoured him. As he walked through the lobby, the night doorman, a man Marcus usually ignored, didn't offer his customary, "Good evening, Mr. Thorne." Instead, he was staring at his phone, his thumb flicking rapidly. Marcus caught a glimpse of the screen, a blurry video of himself at the bar, the caption reading, "Finance bro gets humbled by ex-wife's black card, #instant karma, #rich vines." The penthouse was a tomb of white marble and glass. The lights were on a smart timer, casting a sterile, bluish glow over the minimalist furniture. Marcus walked into the living room, his wet shoes squeaking against the floor. He looked for Tiffany. Her silver heels were by the door, but the bedroom was empty. The walk-in closet, usually a sanctuary of designer labels, was a jagged gap of empty hangers. She hadn't just left the gala, she had erased herself from his life with the surgical precision of a professional. On the marble vanity lay a single piece of paper, a printout of a news alert from the Wall Street Journal. Vanguard hedge faces liquidity crisis as Vane Quantum pulls billions. SVP Marcus Thorne terminated amid integrity scandal. Marcus sank onto the edge of the bed, the silence of the apartment pressing in on his eardrums like deep-sea pressure. He opened the top drawer of the nightstand, looking for a bottle of Xanax, but his hand brushed against something else, a small velvet-lined box. He pulled it out. Inside was the Cartier love bracelet, the quaint gift he had used to dismiss Sophia's pain. He looked at the screwdriver that came with it, the tool designed to lock the woman into the jewelry, to signify a permanent bond. He realized then that he had never used it to lock her in. He had used it to bar the doors of her mind, trying to keep her from seeing her own worth. He remembered her face the day he gave it to her. She hadn't been ungrateful for the gold. She had been mourning the loss of her career, and he had offered her a shackle. "Did you see the animal shelter hit its goal?" she had asked. He hadn't understood then. He understood now. She wasn't talking about the money. She was talking about the infrastructure. She had built the site that saved those animals. She had been a creator, and he had tried to turn her into a consumer. Meanwhile, miles away, the Maybach glided toward a different part of the city. Sophia sat in the back, the blue light of the street lamps washing over her face. Julian Vane remained quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. "You're thinking about the lab," Julian said softly. Sophia nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the Centurion card. "Marcus thinks this card is the prize. He thinks the dress is the victory. But I was thinking about the night the saline electrolyte leaked and ruined the floor of that Brooklyn warehouse. I was thinking about the 3 days I spent eating nothing but peanut butter because I'd spent my last $50 on a new cathode." She looked out at the skyline. "The gala tonight. It felt like a dream. But the lab was real. The dirt under my fingernails was real. Marcus never understood that you can't buy a legacy, you have to bleed for it." "He was a necessary catalyst, Sophia," Julian said. "Some people are meant to be the wind in our sails. Others are meant to be the rocks that force us to build a stronger hull." "He wasn't either," Sophia replied. "He was just a mirror that showed me a version of myself I refused to be." She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, worn photograph she kept tucked behind her ID. It was a picture of her father, a man who had spent 40 years working as an electrician in Queens. He was wearing his work blues, his hands stained with grease, smiling at the camera. "Always look at the system, Soph," he used to tell her. "Don't just look at the light bulb, look at the wires, look at the source." Marcus had spent his life looking at the light bulbs, trying to find the brightest ones to stand under. Sophia had spent hers looking for the source. And tonight, The source had finally powered her all the way to the top. The car pulled up to her brownstone. It wasn't a penthouse. It was a home filled with books, the scent of lavender, and a small office where she still kept her first legal pads. As she stepped out, she felt the weight of the evening lifting. The YouTube drama, the viral clips, the fallen SVP. It was all noise. Inside her house, she walked to her desk and opened a laptop. A notification popped up from her lead engineer. Phase 3 testing complete. Efficiency at 98%. We're ready for the global launch. Sophia sat down, the midnight blue silk of her dress pooling around her. She didn't look at the news. She didn't check the comments. She began to type. Back in the cold white penthouse, Marcus Thorne sat with the Cartier bracelet in his hand. He looked at the smart fridge, the designer chairs, and the empty closet. He realized he was surrounded by things that had no soul, bought with money he no longer had, to impress people who had already forgotten his name. He picked up the screwdriver and, in a fit of sudden, impotent rage, tried to scratch his own name into the gold. But the titanium-hardened surface of his own vanity wouldn't even leave a mark. He was alone. He was broke. And for the first time in his life, he was silent. The sun rose over Manhattan, not with a celebratory gold, but with a pale, unforgiving grey that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus's penthouse. For the first time in years, the automated shades didn't hum to life. The building's management had already remotely throttled the smart features of the unit following the news of his firm's collapse. Marcus woke up on the sofa, still in his tuxedo, the fabric stiff with dried rainwater and spilled scotch. The silence was broken by the sharp, persistent buzz of his personal cell phone. He reached for it, hope flickering like a dying candle. Tiffany? Alistair? It was a process server. There was a knock at the door. Not the deferential rap of a concierge, but the heavy, rhythmic strike of someone carrying a summons. "Marcus Thorne, you've been served," a muffled voice called through the heavy oak. Marcus didn't move. He watched the white envelope slide under the door. It was a lawsuit from Graff Diamonds for the $1.5 million bid, coupled with a secondary filing from the Sterling family's estate lawyers, demanding he cease and desist using the Sterling name in any professional capacity. They were scrubbing him from their history like a stain on a silk tie. He looked at his reflection in the darkened television screen. He looked aged, his face hollowed by the realization that he was no longer a player. He was a cautionary tale, a viral clip that had already been remixed into 100 success versus ego montages across the internet. He opened his laptop, his hands trembling. He went to the Helios Innovations website. The homepage didn't feature the gala. It didn't feature the black card or the midnight blue dress. Instead, there was a simple, high-resolution photo of a village in sub-Saharan Africa, where a newly installed Helios battery array was powering a small medical clinic. The headline read, "Energy is a human right, not a luxury." Below it was a quote from the CEO, "We don't build markers of success, we build systems of survival." Sophia Reyes. Marcus felt a sob catch in his throat, not of grief, but of the sheer, overwhelming weight of his own insignificance. He had spent 10 years trying to make her feel small so that he could feel tall. He had treated her intelligence as a service to his ambition. Now she was the sun, and he was just a shadow that had finally been cast out. Meanwhile, at the Helios headquarters in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of Marcus's ruin. The air was electric with the hum of servers and the low, urgent murmur of engineers. Sophia stood at the glass wall of her office, looking out over the East River. She had traded the blue silk for a pair of dark jeans and a simple black turtleneck. Her hair was back in its natural, unruly curls. She looked like the woman Marcus had met a decade ago, but her eyes held the gravity of 1,000 battles won in the dark. Julian Vane walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee in plain paper cups. He set one on her desk. "The New York Times is downstairs." Julian said. They want a profile. The woman who broke Wall Street with a card. Every talk show from London to Tokyo is calling. You're the hero of a modern myth, Sophia. Sophia turned, taking the coffee. I don't want to be a myth, Julian. Myths are for people who want to be worshipped. I just want the batteries to work. They do work, Julian reminded her. The Q4 projections are already being revised upward. You're not just a scientist anymore. You're the most powerful woman in the energy sector. Marcus called it quaint, she said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. The community gardens, the data sets. He thought power was something you flaunt. He never understood that true power is being the person people call when the lights go out. She walked to her desk and picked up a small, weathered legal pad, the one she had used in the Brooklyn warehouse. She flipped through the pages of frantic equations, seeing the coffee stains and the tear marks from the nights she thought she would fail. Julian, she said, her voice turning professional, I want to set up a trust. I want to buy the debt on Marcus's penthouse. Julian raised an eyebrow. You want to save him? No, Sophia said, her gaze hardening. I want to turn it into a subsidized housing unit for women in tech who are starting over after domestic or financial abuse. I want to take that cold, white cage and fill it with people who are building something real. Marcus can keep his Porsche, but he's not going to live on a throne built from my stolen years. Julian nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. I'll have the legal team start the acquisition. It'll be a poetic resolution. It's not poetry, Sophia replied, sitting down at her computer. It's just an upgrade. She took the Centurion card out of her pocket and set it on the desk. To Marcus it had been a weapon of humiliation. To the world it was a symbol of her arrival. But to Sophia it was just a tool, a piece of metal that allowed her to never have to ask a man for permission ever again. She turned her back to the skyline and began to work. She didn't check the news. She didn't look at the viral videos. She was already miles ahead, into a future where Marcus Thorne was nothing more than a footnote in a story about the light. This story reminds us that true power isn't found in the labels we wear or the status symbols we flaunt. It's built in the quiet moments of resilience and the courage to start over. Sophia didn't just win a game of social chess. She reclaimed her soul by building a legacy that served others instead of her ego. If Sophia's journey from dead weight to a visionary titan resonated with you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own worth. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories of quiet strength and epic comebacks. Thank you for watching.